Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many of you today. My name is Brooke Wirtschafter. I'm the Director of Community Organizing at ICAR. ICAR is hosting this event today, and we're so glad to see all of you here as part of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. This afternoon session is called Indigenous Rights, Jewish Environmental Stewardship, and Climate Justice. And we're here today, we've got two ICAR members and experts who are here to lead this conversation. Emily McDonald, who's here with us, is a member of ICAR. Emily lives in Scottsdale, Arizona now, and she's a member of the Navajo Nation and will tell us more about her own background and experience. But she's here to speak with us particularly about the Indigenous movement for environmental justice. And Devorah Brous, who's also here with us today, is one of our leaders, is a longtime organizer and activist. She's a regenerative urban homesteader and environmental educator and a frontline community organizer. And Devorah has for many years, before she moved back to the States, she was for many years an organizer with the Bedouin community in Israel and Palestine. And while she was there, she founded a nonprofit called Bustan, which means the fruit orchard, where she really deeply embedded herself in Indigenous organizing around environmental justice work. So we're really looking forward to this conversation today between Emily and Devorah and thinking together about how we understand environmental justice work, how we can be better allies, how we can understand one another's backgrounds and work together for the kind of just and sustainable world that we all want to live in. So with that, I welcome Emily and Devorah. And Emily, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke, and for Devorah for collaborating with me on this. Yate she Emily McDonald Yanishia, To'ahana Nishle, Izlana Bashashin, Delegana Dashiche, Delegana Dashanella. Hello, my name is Emily, and I am an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I am of the Near the Water people and the Many Goats clan. And for you, Devorah.
Thank you. In Hebrew, I would say my name is Devorah Bat Malka Vishalom. And if I were with the Bedouin community, they would call me Devorah. They wouldn't say Devorah, they would say Sela, like the mother of your daughter. So in one tradition, we're blessing the parents who have brought us into this moment. And in another culture, we're blessing the fact that we are parents of descendants. We have children. Now, there's so much richness in the way that different cultures come together. There's also so much to learn from each other and to take a pause and understand just how rich and vital it is that we're able to come together to explore this subject today. We want to do a land acknowledgement. We want to begin from this place where each of us takes a moment to acknowledge the traditional, the ancestral, the unceded territories that we are situated on. So what we could do is we'd ask you to put into the chat window, if you are able to, the name of the Indigenous peoples on whose land we are standing today. Now, this is an invitation just to take a moment to acknowledge that some people refer to these lands as Turtle Island. Some people refer to these lands as North America. The peoples where I am at home right now are the Tongva peoples. They stewarded this land for thousands of years prior to being forcibly removed by colonization. There's been a lot of erasure. There's been genocide. There has been enslavement of Indigenous peoples who to this day are still enduring systems of oppression that attack their lives and their cultures and their waters and their waterways and their foodways and their sovereignty. So as you're populating the chat, what I would say is that we are all gathered here as descendants of colonizers and colonized, as descendants of enslaved peoples and enslavers, as immigrants or refugees or Indigenous peoples. We all have a role in the tikkun, in the healing, And may this acknowledgement help to spur or feed us as we work to try to figure out how to be in right relationship with the land. So I want to invite you to just take a breath here with us. And step into that place of gratitude for the lands that we're on and for the air that fills our lungs. And may all the people know safety and sovereignty and self-determination on their ancestral lands everywhere.
Man.
So when Emily and I were preparing for this session, our hopes were that we could frame a conversation that obviously we cannot address all of the questions that will come up over the course of the next hour together, but that may help set the table for some deeper discovery, and some great exploration over the course of the coming months and years of your lives, of our lives. So the framing I want to offer is going to come from Braiding Sweetgrass, this absolutely exquisite book. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she describes two cosmologies. On the one side of the world, the people who grew into relationship with the earth from the creation story of Sky Woman, the ancestral gardener who tended the garden for the well-being of all. On the other side of the world, there was a woman who was banished from the garden just for tasting its fruits. She was exiled, and she was instructed to subdue the wilderness in order to eat. She had to subdue the wilderness in which she was outcast. And when the two met, the world bears the scars of that meeting to this day. Now, what I would say to cap this is that many of us might not identify as colonial supremacists that grab land or that Judaize land in Israel, Palestine, but there's an additional layer to unpack here as Jews. And Rabbi Gershon Winkler writes about the similarities between Jews that have suffered at the hands of oppressive host cultures, calling us devils, calling us witches for 1,700 years. Now, the native peoples in this land have suffered at the hands of white supremacy for over 500 years. They've been called barbaric and primitive, and both peoples were subjected to deadly campaigns, forced removal, exile from sacred lands. So we come together here to try to learn as much as we can from one another. And so in that spirit of what the Kabbalists would refer to as bitul hayesh, like this kind of canceling of everything we thought we knew in order to just create enough expansiveness to be here right now, to be able to listen to things that might be really hard. My invitation is to see this space as a place where we're not going to be combative, but a place where it's safe for all of us to be in here together. So bitul hayesh. So please take care of yourself throughout this session. If you need to get up and walk away from the screen because something that's been said is hard, then do so and come back and rejoin us. Okay, and so with that, as we spiral deeper, I turn this over to Emily.
Thank you, Deborah. So first, I want to explain what Indigenous environmental stewardship is. I'm going to define that and also some key terms, like words that we'll be using throughout the session. So the first is Indigenous environmental stewardship, which is the use of ancestral Indigenous practices for ecological conservation and environmental maintenance. Another term that we're going to use is settler colonialism, which is the action of a dominant group to remove and erase Indigenous people from their land, which is then to be used by settlers in perpetuity. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, development of enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and practices. And last but not least, manifest destiny. I'm sure many of you have heard this term before. It was a cultural phenomenon spearheaded by President Polk in the 19th century. And this was the belief that America had an inherent destiny to expand across North America, and it also had divine origins. And there are three parts to this. The first is that American virtues and American institutions believed that this was part of like broader American values. The next is the belief that the United States had the right to remake America in the world in the image of America. And last, they believed that it was divinely, divinely, what's the word I'm looking for? It came from God. That's the word I was trying to use. That God gave them, this mission to go across the land, westward expansion, that sort of thing. And a lot of this relationship to the land is something that, as an Indigenous person, like I've had this thought my entire life. So growing up, I was taught that I didn't exist to take things from the land. My relationship was to exist with the land. I was to treat it the way that I would treat another human being, meaning I would not be reckless, I would not intentionally cause harm, and I would not engage in any form of destruction. That's sort of a pan-Indigenous value. So across, the United States and in Latin America, it's a common Indigenous belief that we are here to, quote, be a good ancestor because we are in charge of taking care of the land for the next generation. So they will have like the resources to enjoy and thrive down the road. Okay, Devorah, do you want to explain how this is either similar or different to like the Jewish perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think there's immense similarities with our tradition, the Jewish tradition, in that I would start by saying a lot of the mystical teachings that connect us back to the land are teachings that like every single blade of grass is connected to, is empowered by a spirit being. That stones, minerals, plants, and animals, organisms, every organism that breathes is in deep connection with humans, and that it's our kind of honorable opportunity to be able to connect with Shomrei Adama, the teachings of nature and the world around us. It's like a lot of the mystical teachings from our tradition have been uprooted or lost in defense of ourselves against the Crusades and the Inquisition. A lot of the sacred texts that were more mystical were burned. However, what's happening today is a really powerful revitalization, a resurgence of people connecting back to our land-based teachings, our agrarian laws for the ways in which we grow food, for the ways that we're not about to give a green light to any form of waste, like bal tashchit. We cannot let anything even the size of a mustard grain go to waste. And what's happening at the end of this year, 5781, is our Shemitah. So the sabbatical, the call to rest our lands, to let them lie fallow in order to regenerate. These ideas are all coming back alive again with Jewish farms popping up all over the country, and really a resurgence of interest in understanding more how to be in deep and right relationship with the land. So I personally find myself very compelled by the Arba Ruchot, the four winds. And oftentimes when we are working with the four winds, the Rosh Chodesh circles, bringing in the directions and the seasons and the elements. Oftentimes people will say, well, that seems really like native. That seems really pagan. Where, how is that Jewish? You know, and there's like, this goes back to Sefer Yetzirah, and there's also lots of teachings about this in the Zohar. But what I'm interested in hearing maybe from you is something about like your personal connection to the practice of calling in the 4 directions.
Sure. So the number 4 is sort of like the chai of Navajo culture. You know, we have 4 cardinal directions, you know, the 4 sacred mountains. And so that's because it's a central number, so much of our practices, you know, the 4 seasons revolve around the number 4. And we're very conscious of that when we're participating in any cultural or religious activities. And that has impacted the way that, you know, we care for the environment. So we know when to clear the land. We know how to maintain the land depending on the time of the year.
An interesting note is that I think, you know, we're very similar in that we've been exiled. We've been forced off of our lands. And until Israel, the founding of the state of Israel, many of us have not been land-based. Many of us have come to like want to dive deeper into land-based practices and understand more about the all of the teachings of Pe'ah and Leket and Shichecha and Orla, these ideas of leaving the fruits from your trees for the people who have worked on those worked in the fields and helped to grow those trees and helped to and just been part of your community. Like, those fruits are not yours alone. The fruits of your labor are yours to share in community. And so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that kind of generosity. It's not necessarily that we grow fruits in order to extract the fruits and sell them. So, you know, that's one aspect of kind of stewarding lands. But in our tradition, there's a very clear, you know, push to get us to think about the land, the farm workers, and the community, so we can restore equity between the landowners and the landless. Can you speak to that from your understandings?
Sure. So in my community, historically, people had a specific type of like crop or, you know, farmland that they maintained, and that wasn't just for yourself. Like, there was this mentality of sharing with everyone in the community. For example, my family name on my Navajo side, Peaches, comes from my family's history of owning peach orchards. When the settlers came and they said, "What's your last name?" You know, we're like, "What do you mean? Like, what is a last name?" And they said, "Oh, you own peach orchards, so you're going to be the Peaches family." And you know, when you look at other Navajo names, it's sort of an extension of that. And so when you grow a specific crop, we have something similar to Thanksgiving that occurs in October, November. That's like a fall harvest where everybody comes and you have a meal. And, you know, you share with everyone, whether that means growing produce or if you have sheep, which is like a huge delicacy in Navajo culture. It's a community-based approach to making sure that everyone is provided for and that you're not here to take things from the land. The land grants you the permission to thrive and survive.
It's very powerful. It's very powerful. It's reminding me, I'm a vegetarian, but it's reminding me of when I would spend a lot of time in Bedouin communities. Like, the single greatest way of honoring the guest is often to like slaughter an animal and gift it to you know, a communal meal that we would share together. And there were times where like that was something extremely challenging for me, because I didn't want to be disrespectful. And it was also, it was something that it's just, we have very kind of different ways of sharing. I remember also times where people would offer me to sleep in their bedroom, and they would sleep on the cold floor just so I, as an outsider, wouldn't have to, just crash on a couch.
Mhm.
So like these gestures are so, they're just exquisite, they're vast.
Mhm.
So there are distinctions, there are similarities between these two cultures. I would love to ask if you could share with us a little bit about how colonialism has, brought these two cultures together. What kind of like current relationship do you and your family members have with the land today, and how has colonialism affected that?
Sure. So to begin this, we have to go way back to the beginning. I'm here to burst the bubble that history did not begin in 1492 when Columbus sailed to the Americas. But today, there are over 570, I believe 577 as of recently, federally recognized tribes in the United States today. And it's important to recognize that we're not a monolith, and so our experiences do vary. A lot of our access to ancestral homelands depends on geographic location. So for example, you have tribes in the East Coast who are heavily impacted first because they were the ones that the Europeans encountered first. Whereas you have people in the Southwest or the Pacific Northwest who had time to, sort of prepare for that imminent arrival. And so they were able to maintain their connection to the land and some of their ancestral practices in a very different way. So our relationship to the land now has been heavily impacted by, there are 3 court cases, they're called the Marshall Trilogy. And one of those cases is called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. So the Cherokee traditionally lived in, what is the northern part of Georgia. And they were forcibly removed, as part of the Trail of Tears. And as part of this court case, the Cherokee Nation brought this case to the Supreme Court because they were seeking an injunction, because they said that the state of Georgia was trying to strip the Cherokee of their rights and access to ancestral land that was guaranteed by treaties that they signed with the United States. And spoiler alert, the Supreme Court did not rule in favor of the Cherokee Nation. And they said that the Cherokee Nation's relationship to the state and to the United States was like a ward to a guardian. And so that case and the other 2 cases in the Marshall Trilogy sort of laid this foundation that we are not competent to take care of ourselves, and we are not competent to take care of our own homelands.
It's reminding me a little bit in this moment of the Bedouin, who are referred to under Israeli law as invaders and as trespassers. So there is that sense that they are also not competent to be able to steward the lands that they are today contained into. And I'll just share that where I spent most of my time was in the northern Negev. There are 155,000 Bedouin living in the south of Israel. And many of them have been forcibly moved into a triangle of territory between Beersheba, Arad, and Dimona. And they've been packed in to a space where almost all of the heaviest and most polluting infrastructure of the state is also with them inside an unsovereign reservation-like triangle of territory called the Sayij. And that means fence in Arabic. And this area has a toxic waste incinerator and 19 agro and petrochemical factories and oil storage depots and pipelines that pipe in oil and water, electric power plants, an airport. And it's not desirable, it's not hospitable, and certainly not easy to live in a place with that many really heavily polluting burdens on their shoulders to take care of without having proper infrastructure to support them. And that's what you see, I think, often also here. Environmental racism would have us understand that the heaviest burdens for health are often falling on the backs of brown and Black people in this country. So do you want to maybe also give us a little window into COVID and what it's been like in your community?
Sure. So the Navajo Nation is very isolated. You know, the closest town to my hometown off the reservation is 2.5 hours away. And our healthcare system falls under the federal government called IHS, Indian Health Services. And we don't have the infrastructure to provide the resources that people need. For example, ventilators, if people get really sick. If someone is really sick, they're often airlifted out of the reservation into a hospital, you know, either in Flagstaff, Arizona, or in the Phoenix or Tucson area, depending on where they are. And we just don't have the resources to get everyone the help that they need. We also have a lot of multi-generational households, people that are living together, you know, grandparents living with their children and their grandchildren. And so if one person gets sick, then everybody gets sick. And so right now, like what we're focused on is, especially in the winter, making sure that people have safe places to go if they're isolating and the resources to stay safe. So 2 out of every 3 Navajo households doesn't have running water or electricity. So one of the basic tenets that, you know, the CDC is telling us to wash your hands, it's impossible like if you don't have running water. So we have grassroots organizations and the Navajo Nation that are donating hand sanitizer and other supplies so that people, you know, can try and stay, you know, as clean as they can during this time.
Yes, another similarity. I spent most of the time working in a place called Village Number 32, which doesn't appear on the map of the state of Israel. It's 12 kilometers outside of Beersheba. It's a place called Wadi Na'am, and it is populated by the El Azazme people, who also, like 90,000 other Bedouin in Israel's Negev, don't have access to drinking water. They don't have access to electricity. And so COVID has been a burden as well, as you can imagine. A lot of similarities here.
Can you also talk about how that isolation has impacted the community in terms of like culture erasure?
Yes, how isolation has impacted culture erasure.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I mean, I think I would understand that culture erasure is happening in the Bedouin communities, not necessarily from isolation so much as the land issues. So there's a territorial war over land, and even up until the past few months, there have been like very, very strong clashes between the Bedouin that live in the Negev lands and unrecognized villages and the Jewish National Fund and the Israel Green Patrol and the Israel Lands Administration, bodies that are doing whatever they can to get control over the landscape and put it back into the hands of for Jewish use down the road. So the Negev, 60% of the land is untouched. It's unpopulated. There's 8% of the population of Israel lives in the Negev. And so that land is very open. And the culture, the shepherding, the original like pastoral way of life, the dry lands farming of lentils and barley and wheat, has been all but deemed anachronistic by the Israeli government, who is, you know, repeatedly just spraying the crops with Roundup to convey a very clear message. Don't take these lands into your usage. We would rather have them unused and left in the hands of closed military zones that no one can go into than to have you grow food for your families on these lands. So there is a culture erasure that's happening when people are forced to relinquish their land claims on unrecognized villages because they can't make ends meet as shepherds. And then they're put into recognized townships where they're offered the chance to have water and electricity and pretty high rates of crime, pepper those villages because they're so far away from their traditional ways. So how about if we switch gears a little bit and we talk about allyship and accompliship. I'd love to see if folks want to put something in the chat about this. We've created a resource for you with some background reading materials that might prove useful. They might be helpful in kind of parsing this question a little bit of what's the difference between an ally and an accomplice, or what's the difference between someone who might do a little bit of like solidarity work versus someone who might put their bodies on the line to stand in solidarity with a community. And I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe an example like Standing Rock of where this has gone well and where it has gone really awry.
Sure. So on the positive side of the spectrum, we had lawyers that would come and volunteer their time because a lot of activists were jailed. And so, people were coming in droves to offer, their skills and their resources. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you had non-native people coming into these spaces, again, with that mentality going all the way back to Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, where they didn't think that we were capable of managing our own affairs. So one of the things that was common in the community, it was a community native norm, was to wear long skirts. It's an ancestral practice of the tribes in that region, which from an outside perspective, it seems really impractical, because you're out camping, you're out in the wilderness and it's cold in North Dakota. But it was a very important thing for the people, regardless of your cultural or like racial ties, to follow. And a lot of the non-native women did not want to do that. And so that caused some friction. Another thing is native people, or non-native people, coming in and trying to take over leadership positions when they weren't supposed to be doing that in those spaces. So there was a white woman, for example, who tried to facilitate this quasi talking circle with like a handmade talking stick that was very like stereotypically native. And it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, that there was this outsider coming in and telling native people, this is not the way you should do things. I know how to do it. And Deb, I'd love to hear some of your perceptions about like these types of issues.
It's very interesting because it hits home. Like I am that white person who's gone in and spent 15 years on the front lines with Indigenous communities, and so like I was sharing the example before of not knowing what to do when I saw like a goat head and eyeballs on the plate. They had just slaughtered an animal for me, but I'm a vegetarian, and really I didn't know how to respond. There were many moments over the time that I was running Bustan that I had no idea what to do. And so there were like, I can think of times I brought 500 people into Wadinam to build a medical clinic, and we were working with traditional building practices called baika. This is the way that the Bedouin used to originally build before they started to live in these tin shanties with corrugated metal that are super hot. And so we did this beautiful, very powerful community solidarity program that involved the construction of a medical clinic and then bringing in a team of Israeli and Palestinian doctors and solar refrigeration to take care of the medical needs of the community that's off the grid, that's living off the grid. But there were times, like the women were never present when we were holding circle with the leadership of the village, and it were always men. And so there were times when I would say, well, I have to bring in the women that are in leadership of Bustan to sit with us. And not all of us are married, so we don't cover our hair in the traditional Jewish, religious Jewish way. And I didn't realize that maybe that could be a flagrant, violation of like basic respect, that I should have covered my hair every single time I went in there, but I was young. I didn't know, right? So there are things like that that I often think about that I could have done differently. And I guess I imagine that there are probably people on this call with us that have the right, like their heart's in the right place, and they come from a place of goodwill, and they really want to do something that's meaningful. So I'm wondering if you have just some thoughts about what it means to be involved with Indigenous-led organizing for land back, for land trust, for any of the kind of solidarity work that's happening today in this country.
Sure. So there are a couple things that, that non-native people can do to be good allies. So the first, and it's often the hardest step, is to be prepared to look inward and to hold yourself accountable, for past wrongs, even if it makes you uncomfortable. And that's really important because a lot of what gets blurry between allyship and, not being a good ally is not making that distinction and thinking that you know more than the Indigenous people and that you have a right to be in that space. The next is, don't show up for clout. Don't show up to take a picture of yourself and put it on Instagram or Facebook. And this woke culture that has been created has been good in the sense that it has inspired a lot of people to act, but it's also inspired performative activism. And that's something that, we're trying to avoid as Indigenous people. We are people, we are human. We're not there to, be there for your Instagram post or to show how you came to, a political rally or something. And next, it's also really important. It's be prepared to really do the work. So going back to what I said in the beginning is you need to recognize that this is not your space and that you are a guest. Don't try to hijack a movement or take any type of ownership. Next, don't tell Native people what to do. So since, colonization, we've been told that we don't know how to manage our own affairs, whether that's our own communities or politics or anything in between. And so this mentality has really harmed that relationship, because often when people come in telling us what we need to do, they're doing it through a very Western lens, not realizing the cultural distinctions, that exist between the two groups. And finally, if you do show up, please follow directions. I know it sounds really simple, but we'll tell you what we need and how you can help. It's okay to offer your skills, but if someone says, hey, that's really great that you can do this, but this is the area that we need you in, don't try to fight them on that and say, well, I don't want to do that. I would rather do this instead.
This is so powerful. Because I think so many of our mistakes are just like, they're not happening with intent, and we have so much to be able to learn together if we can just figure this thing out. So in the chat, or actually as part of a resource sheet, I'm going to send you information. I'm going to send you this resource list that we put together where you can read more about what it means to be an accomplice. So I think all of that can be kind of a great way to segue into the future. Like, what does it look like when we have an eye towards tomorrow? What we can do to, I know there's a new government in place. There's 2 Native Americans that are taking leadership in the highest offices that Native leadership has ever had in this country. Things are seeming very, very different than they were just a month ago. So I think what I would say is I'm incredibly inspired by movements like #LandBack, or the work of Segurate Land Trust, the rematriation, the idea of women taking back sovereignty over lands, the idea of places from Sonoma County and Humboldt County, all the way to Montana and South Dakota, and all the way to Maine, actually giving land back to Indigenous management. And there is a movement here, there's a movement here in California, Return California, to return the federal lands that are, so much of the land is held by the state apparatus. These movements are just incredible. There's so much online that you can research to explore more about this. What can we do together?
Well, together, something we can do is continue to educate ourselves. We can, as you mentioned, support the Native people who are moving up and, you know, achieving these positions in the highest levels of government. So like right now, something that we're really pushing is to get Deb Holland confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior. No Native American has ever held this position, which is odd considering that this department is the only cabinet that directly manages people. It manages Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is another agency, like falls under the purview of the Secretary of the Interior. And because Deb Holland has intimate knowledge as a Laguna Pueblo woman, she knows what communities need and she can enact real change. So because of her stance on fracking, she has a very strong stance against like fracking and the oil and gas industry. We're expecting, when I say we, I mean Native people like collectively, are expecting that to be challenged because gas and oil and like fossil fuels are huge industries in the United States. They're a big moneymaker. So I encourage you to reach out to your elected officials regarding that.
Okay.
And Deb, do you want to mention the book that we're going to do, the book club?
That sounds fantastic. So Emily encouraged that I purchase this book. It's called As Long as Grass Grows. It's written by a Native American professor, Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and it's about the Indigenous fight for environmental justice from colonization to Standing Rock. It is a power-packed book that we were thinking would make sense for us to open up to the ICAR and the ICAR from afar and anybody from the Big Bold Climate Fest that would like to join us to do a reading of this book and then a discussion to kind of dive deep into these issues. So can you just show us in the chat, does that resonate, to do some more learning, to get a better handle on what's happening out there, to climb into to a process of actually studying this material with Emily and with me. So I'd like to, it seems like there's a whole heap of yeses. That is fantastic. What we'll do is we'll put in the chat window a date when we can convene to talk, and we'll give you, I don't know, I think we said a couple of weeks to read the book. So maybe Brooke can put in the window the date and the link. Here we go, February 21st at 4 p.m. Okay. This also might be a good time for us to open the room for some questions before we come back to close with some gratitude and a shared blessing.
So I just want to say for a second, thank you so much, Emily and Devorah, and create an opportunity here for people to ask questions. Given how many people we have on the call, I'd like to ask that everybody, if you could please put your questions into the chat, and I will pick questions from the chat and ask them of Emily and Devorah and do my best to get to as many of them as we're able to in the time that we have. And just to give you a sense of timing, so we're going to do a few minutes here for questions, and then we're going to do some closing together to close things out a little bit with Devorah and Emily taking a little bit from the spiritual traditions of both the Jewish people and the Navajo people, so that we can have some closing together and move forward together in a good way. So with that, if you could please put your questions in the chat, I will do my very best to get to as many of them as we can.
So I noticed in the chat, there's some talk about federal versus state recognition of tribes. It's a really complex issue that falls under the federal government. So if you're interested in what qualifies for a tribe to be federally recognized versus state recognized, I'd recommend looking up the Bureau of Indian Affairs because they have like all the criteria that's listed. It's very complex. It's shrouded in a lot of like legalese. And while I understand the bulk of it, I'm not a lawyer, so read it at, I guess, your own risk. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. So Devorah, here's one that's for you. As Jews, how can we influence the Israeli government about their treatment of the Bedouins?
Well, you know, that's a big one, and it's a super challenging one. And what I would say is I think it's really important to bring our conversations to the Jewish National Fund, the Green Zionist Alliance, the different bodies in the United States that are supporting the Blueprint Negev or the new settlements, the kind of aggressive foresting policy that's happening in the name of carbon sequestration. It's like, how can anybody challenge that? That sounds really important, and it's actually vital to plant more trees. We don't need to be demolishing Bedouin hamlets in order to plant more trees. And so I think that getting into the halls of power with the board members that you know at the Jewish National Fund and onwards is a really good place to start. The Israeli government's not about to heed to our pressure as individuals here. We definitely tried for quite some time. I don't believe in that direction at this time.
Thank you. Emily, this one is for you. Can you speak a little bit about what you think about the practice of groups doing land acknowledgements, particularly if those groups are not part of an Indigenous community? Do you think groups should be routinely doing land acknowledgements, or is this woke in a problematic way?
It depends. So land acknowledgements by themselves, I think, are pretty meaningless. You know, just saying I'm on the ancestral land of the Peepash and Acapulco Odom people. Like for me, if I just say that, that really doesn't do anything. I need to follow that up with action. And so going forward, I think anyone can do it, but you need to also learn about the land in which you're on, the people that still live there, and donate your time, your resources to those communities in the area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a big question about fracking. So somebody's asking, what can they do personally to help ban fracking?
I would suggest reaching out to the elected officials in your state and also looking to other Indigenous groups that have mobilized in your area. I don't know where this person is, but a good resource is the Indian Center. So like Phoenix has the Phoenix Indian Center, and they're connected to a lot of the, you know, social and political movements that are ongoing. You can also reach out to a university if they're in your area. For example, in Arizona, we have such a huge Native population that we have organizations that are connected to the people doing the work. So it's going to involve some of your own research, but it's definitely possible, like, to get involved with people who are doing the work.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question about for Emily, I think, what would be your top resources to look for projects and legislation that Native peoples are working on? How should non-Native people make choices and learn about and prioritize what they can do to support?
I can post them in the chat, but there are some Native resources. Social media is also really good, like Instagram, Facebook. They have organizations and also like companies that work on these issues. And if you purchase things from them, that also goes like towards funding the political efforts on the ground. So I can add that to the chat.
Okay, thank you. How can non-Indigenous Jews support and actually give land back?
I would say that, again, it also goes to the political level. So advocating like with your elected officials and aligning with the Native people to understand, you know, the implications that come with getting that ancestral stewardship back. And it varies depending on geographic location. And as I said, there are over 570 tribes. They're all not a monolith. So land back is going to look very different for different tribes. Some, it's just access to particular resources that they use for ceremonies. Others, it's a specific like patch of land. Like California, for example, recently had Big Sur given back to like tribal communities who had not had the space to steward that land for hundreds of years. So reach out to the organizations in your area, and they'll be able to like point you in the right direction of how you can get involved.
And here's a follow-up on that, I think. There's a Jewish farm in our area, Yesod, and their plan is to give the land they're on back to Indigenous people in 50 years. What do you think of this?
I fully support it. We haven't had access to our land and been able to maintain it, for so many centuries. And so for us to be able to care for it in a way that makes sense to us, and keep in mind, like land stewardship, a lot of these practices are things that seem really common, like controlled burns, for example, things that we have done, but we're not allowed to do because of like different government statutes, or, wherever you're living, it's either like a federal or a state thing. And so I fully support this organization or this farm giving land back to Indigenous people.
Devorah, do you think that there's any kind of parallel between that and anything that's going on with the Bedouin or could be going on in Israel? Is there any kind of movement to think seriously about giving land back?
No, that we are so far away from that level of organizing. But I do think that Yesod, and I think that Wilderness Torah and some of the other places that are on Indigenous lands that are in conversation with their communities are really taking the lead in this conversation. You may be, aghast at the idea of giving your land back. What does that mean? That doesn't necessarily mean the private land holdings. For example, here in California, that is the organizing is around the federal land management. Should that be given back to the land, the hands of Indigenous communities that, were the prior stewards? And this, in many cases, is only a win. It's like, it can only be better if instead of fighting fire, trying to put out fires that are taking over the West Coast for, season after season and like scorching the earth. If instead of fighting fire, we are working with fire through controlled burns. There are just different ways of addressing the changes that are happening in our climate and being more progressive and actually really proactive about the ways in which we want to envision like this coming, the coming decade. And the years that will follow after that.
So with that, I want to turn it to the two of you to help us close.
Sure.
Okay, I would love to thank you for showing up here. I imagine some of this conversation was hard, and there are so many reasons why we need to be able to sit with what's hard. So I would really like to just ask you to take a moment and to look at your hands and to take a nice and slow exhale. Just notice what it feels like to be in your body, instead of just in this hard place in our heads where we've just been. Notice maybe the wrinkles or the veins, the creases on the folds in your skin, the shine of your nails. Your hands, have the gift of doing so much to help us make a big tikkun here. And so with that, I just want to ask you to put your hands up to the screen for just a moment. Look at everybody's hands. Maybe put yourself into gallery. Can we do that? Hold your hands up to the screen. Our hands together can do so much. Just take a breath with me here. Thank you, and I turn it to Emily.
Okay, I'm going to read a Navajo blessing, and if you all close your eyes, I'll get started. In beauty I walk, with beauty before me I walk, with beauty behind me I walk, with beauty above me I walk, with beauty around me I walk. It has become beauty again. Today I will walk out, everything negative will leave me. I will be as I was before. I will have a cool breeze over my body. I will have a light body. I will be happy forever. Nothing will hinder me. I walk with beauty before me. I walk with beauty behind me. I walk with beauty below me. I walk with beauty above me. I walk with beauty around me. My words will be beautiful. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
Just want to thank you both so much for opening up this conversation for all of us. There was so much here to cover, and obviously so much more we still have to cover. So I want to invite everyone here to join us again on the 21st at 4 p.m. for the conversation about the book, As Long as Grass Grows. I put the link in the chat, and you'll be able to see it. Will be listed on the ICAR website on our calendar. And if you get our emails, it'll be in our upcoming emails as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Devorah and Emily for leading us in this conversation. And blessings to you all. Be well. Stay safe.